Today we are reading What Was the Boston Tea Party, Chapter 4 to Chapter 6. Today, I hope you enjoy, like and subscribe this video, and so on. Let's get on to it. Chapter 4, Party Time. It was around 6 o'clock in the evening. About 50 men, some crudely dressed as American Indians, appeared at the back of the Old South meeting house. 2 by 2, they began marching on Griffin's Wharf. Other men and boys joined them on the way. Eventually, the group numbered some 150. Their costume varied. Some looked vaguely like Mohawk and Nassaget Indians. The men carried axes and hatchets, and wore wool blankets and maybe feathers from goose quills. They had smeared their faces with paint, burnt cork, charcoal, or soot from the fireplace. Those who joined along the way had time only to darken their faces with grease or whatever they could put their hands on. It was very important not to be recognized. A 16-year-old boy said later, "We resembled devils from the bottomless pit rather than men." By the time the Indians reached the wharf, the crowd had gathered. As many as 1,000 people stayed at the shoreline in near total silence to watch what happened next. Once on the wharf, the Indians ran smack into a British officer who drew his sword. One of the group aimed a gun at him and said, "The path is wide enough for us all. We have nothing to do with you and intend you no harm if you keep your own way peaceably. We shall keep ours." The officer wisely stepped aside and let them pass. The men split into 3 groups and boarded the 3 ships. The ordered captains and crews below decks. Again, they promised to do them no harm. Only the chests of tea were in danger. They politely asked for candles and the keys to the hatches. With ropes and pulleys, they hoisted their heavy chests, each weighing 400 pounds, up to the decks. They swung their axe, crack, to break their chest open. Then they hurled the chest into the ocean. Chest after chest got dumped into the harbor. All 342 of them, tea leaves flying everywhere. Carpenters worked side by side with printers, doctors with bricklayers, farmers and barbers, ordinary men. "Oh, I never labored harder in my life," said one man. From far away, it might have looked as if the ships were vomiting. It was almost a play performed by the light of torches, lanterns and the moon. Those on board could hear the creaking of the decks, the clumping of men's boots, and the heavy crash of chests hitting water. Listening from a distance, a British reporter wrote later, "You could hear distinctly the ripping open of the chest and no other sound." Talking was severely discouraged. The men communicated when they had to, with whistles or grunts. "We were merry at the idea of making so large a cup of tea for the fishes," a man said later. They needed to work as fast as possible and then scram. Punishment for theft in Massachusetts was hanging. A young man had been hanged for it just weeks later. This was theft and destruction of property on an unheard of scale. This was also a crime against England and King George III. Some 46 tons of tea leaves were seeping in Boston Harbor and worth amount $1 and $2 million today. At any moment, the colonists half expected to be fired at. Indeed, armed British Royal Navy warships were patrolling the harbor. That night, their guns were pointed directly at Griffin's Wharf. The Indians were gambling that the large crowd on shore would protect them, that the British wouldn't risk killing so many innocent bystanders. The tide was low at night. There was so much tea that some of it accidentally spilled off onto the decks of the ship and had to be swept off. Some men stood in the icy, shallow water to chop up the chest so they would sink faster. Without violence, except towards the tea, they took such care that only one injury was reported. A man was knocked out cold when a chest of tea hit him. His friend carried him on shore to safety and then went right back to work. Several people tried to steal some of the dumped tea. Not a smart idea. One man was caught stuffing tea into the lining of his coat. He got beaten up. Another man was seen scooping leaves into a canoe, so his canoe was overturned. Within 3 hours, it was all over. Men made sure the ship's decks were swept clean, and they shook out their boots over the railing to get rid of any trapped tea. The ship's crew were brought up to the check that nothing except the chests had been wrecked. Then the exhausted boys and men marched back into town. The harbor was one giant salty teapot, bringing with what would have made 18.5 million cups of tea. What a tea party! Chapter 5. High spirits for a short time. Everyone got home safely by 10 that night. Their coats were fuzzy with tea. Their shoes and boots were still coated with stray tea leaves. The next day, black leaves blanketed parts of the harbor as far as the eye could see, miles of shoreline. Some of the men went out and beat down the floating tea with oars to prevent it from being stolen. Some vowed not to eat fish from Boston Harbor for a while because they had been swimming in the hated tea. One man recalled that they had all pledged our owner that we would not reveal our secret. The next day, men probably peeked at each other for telltale signs of soot or paint behind the ear, but the code of secrecy seemed to hold. For years, we still don't know all the names of those who took part. Over 50 years later, a shoemaker named George Hewes broke her silence, saying no disorder took place, and it was observed that the time and the stillness night ensued that Boston had enjoyed for many months. The historical record of the event is sketchy. The one picture we have were done much later on and were not accurate. For example, there were paintings showing a full moon and men in large Indian headdress. Thousands later claimed to have been present, but the different stories didn't add up. Historians now say that most guests at the tea party were young. More than a third were under 21. They came from all walks of life: silversmith, carpenters, bricklayers, leatherworkers, a butcher, a bookseller, a teacher, a boat builder, merchant, 2 college graduates. Paul Revere was probably among them, but not Adams or Hancock. They needed to keep their distance so that they could honestly deny having been present. Predictably, Governor Hutchins raged that this was the boldest stroke that had been struck against British rule in America. The mood in Boston on December 17th was bubbly. John Adams wrote about the height of the joy that sparkles in the eyes of everyone on the street. Gleefully, he mocked. The disappointed discontented Hutchins and his tools. Even Adams, normally prim and proper, called the distraction magnificent. He wrote, "There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last epoch of the periods I greatly admire." He was now convinced that the colonies and England could never mend their differences. But at the same time, he was worried. He made a list called bugbears of the cruel punishment that Britain could impose: banning town meetings, overriding local laws, coming up with new taxes, and sending even more troops that Americans would have to house. The only way to get word of the successful protest to the other colonies was by messengers on horseback. So trusty Paul Revere rode on the only road leading from Boston to New York. It was a journey of 300 miles. By December 21st, he reached New York, and then he went on to Philadelphia, reaching that city by December 24. From there were the new inflamed colonies. Did all colonists approve of the Tea Party? No. Many thousand Southerners, like George Washington, didn't approve of what had happened. Destroying property was criminal. They feared anarchy of the breakdown of law and order. But many others were inspired by the bold move. News reached England on January 9, 1774, and Parliament swung into action. Destroying the tea was over the top. Its members felt an act of war. Parliament charged Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Surely they were the ringleaders with the crime of high treason. If caught, the two were to be brought to England, then hanged. Furthermore, the order said, while you're still living, your bodies are to be taken down, your bowels torn out, your heads then cut off, and your bodies divided each in 4 quarters. John Hancock annulled the bloody order of his death. He realized now that war with England was certain. He called on people to arm themselves and get ready to fight for your houses, lands, wives, children, your liberty, and your God, in order that these vermin will be swept forever from the streets of Boston. Even events would move swiftly after this, and all of John Adams' bugbears and more were to come true. Chapter 6. Boston Goes Hungry. Parliament suspected it would be hard to get enough evidence to arrest individuals, so it decided to punish the whole city of Boston. It passed what Americans called the Intolerable Acts. If something is said to be intolerable, it means that people cannot bear it. The idea was to make an exam of Boston in order to discourage other cities from rebelling. Blah, 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 blah. Until the city paid for the lost tea, Boston's port was to be shut down. No food could come in and no goods either. The only ships allowed in were full of British soldiers. They were there to enforce the law and make sure no more troubles broke out. Now, town meetings were outlawed and Massachusetts was completely under the king's control. Even some in Parliament thought that the punishments were too harsh. England was gambling that being so strict would make the city mend its rebel ways. That did not happen. Soon people were in need of food, but other colonies sent supplies, stores of grain, cattle, sheep from Connecticut, and rice from the South Carolina. Samuel Adams was in charge of the committee that handed out food for the neediest. So the British plan backfired, and Boston's challenge to England inspired other tea parties up and down the coast. Mobs, often dressed as Indians, destroyed tea in New York City, Annapolis in Maryland, Greenwich in New Jersey, and Portsmouth in New Hampshire. John Hancock gloated. No one circumstances could possibly have taken place more effectually to unite the colonies than this maneuver of the tea. At an illegal town meeting, Samuel Adams warned, "It is not the rights of Boston only, but of all America which are now struck out. Not the merchants, but the farmer and every other of men who inhabit this noble continent." Representatives from Virginia sent the statement, If our sister colony of Massachusetts Bay is enslaved, we cannot long remain free. United, we stand; divided, we fall. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia added, an attack made one of those our sister colonies is an attack made on all British America. The Tea Party and the Intolerable Acts had sparked unity among the colonists, a feeling that they were all under the thumb of King George. It was time for a meeting of representatives from all the colonists. This had never happened before. It was called the First Continental Congress, an early version of the present-day U.S. Congress. On September 5th, 1774, at Carpenter Hall in Philadelphia, 56 representatives met from every colony except Georgia. This was because the people in Georgia still needed the support of British soldiers to protect them against possible Indian attacks. Every one of the representatives at the Congress was rich or super rich, except for Samuel Adams. One of them noted Adams' fierceness, saying he eats little, drinks little, sleeps little, thinks much. The motives of some of the men were selfish. George Washington was one of the richest men in America, said about the British. They have no right to put their hands in my pockets. He was talking about his money. He was angry that the British thought they deserved some of his money. They were trying to get it through taxes. By mid-October, the Congress concluded that 13 of Parliament's action against the colonies were unjust. They sent a statement to the king demanding certain basic rights, such as life, liberty, and property. John Adams was thrilled. He said, "This was one of the happiest days of my life. This day convinced me that America will support the province of Massachusetts, or perish with her." The representatives all agreed that they had to meet again on May 10, 1775, to discuss the next steps they would take. I am not a Virginian, but an American. By November, Hancock was calling for 12,000 men to volunteer as Minutemen. They were known as Minutemen men because they claimed to be ready to fight in 60 seconds. He had arranged for his last ship sailing from London to be filled with gunpowder. Rebels in Boston stole cannons from the British and named the first two Hancock and Adams. King George shot back with orders to his troops to crush any revolt. British troops were said to be hunting for Hancock and Adams. At a large gathering in Virginia in March 1775, Patrick Henry gave a stunning speech calling for armed rebellion. He announced, "The war is actually begun. I know not that course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death."